I will now start recording the lecture, and I will hand it over to Dr. O'Brien. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bettina, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to deliver this lecture. And hello to all of you out there. I can't see your faces, but I know you're there, your ears are open, your eyes are looking at the screen, and I want to thank you as well for taking the time to join me today and to welcome you to my classroom, my dining room, all at the same time. And whatever room you happen to be in as you are here for today's class. And it is a kind of a class, an introduction to something that you might take, something you might find in a humanities or a history course at SFU. As you'll see in a few moments, I am drawing very much on this lecture from what I did this past semester in my classroom and from the terrific work of my students. So it gives you a chance to really be part of one of these classes that I've taught and to see what amazing things can come out of our discussions and our lectures. So I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so to you and pause occasionally to ask you a question. Bettina will help me get a poll up on the screen so that you can take part in some of what I'm talking about today. And then at the end, as Bettina said, there'll be a chance to ask questions, not just of me, but also of the others who are here to support you and answer questions about your experience or possible future experience in FASS. So today's lecture, Harnessing History, how the Black Death can help us navigate our COVID-19 world. Why am I talking to you about this? Well, because something remarkable happened this spring. I suddenly found myself living what I was teaching. As Bettina said, my area of specialty is Renaissance Europe and Renaissance Italy specifically. And I had the great good fortune this past spring semester to be teaching two seminars that explored Renaissance Italy. The history of Renaissance Italy more generally in a fourth-year history seminar and in a third-year writing intensive seminar in humanities, the love literature of Renaissance Italy. So wonderful topics to explore. In the second week of the semester, when I tackled head on the Black Death in my History 402 class, this was the headline in the New York Times. Deadly mystery virus reported in 2 new Chinese cities in South Korea. As we were seeing stories pop up with people in the news dressed like this, we were studying people in Renaissance Italy dressed like this. You are looking at a doctor from actually the 16th century, one you would find typically in Europe during the Black Death, with the medieval Renaissance version of PPE. So as these stories were popping up, as we were studying about this pandemic that swept through and devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, we were learning, we were experiencing, we were discovering that we were right in the middle of something that seemed in many ways similar. Every week as the coronavirus spread and took over the news and came to our own shores, my students and I found ourselves wanting to talk more about not just COVID-19, but also what we were studying more about, the backdrop of the Black Death, which shaped so much of what those courses were about. The initial temptation we had was simply to draw some comparisons, to make lists, what's similar, what's different, are we really living through something that's the same? And it's natural to do that when you are thinking about the past, but it only gets you so far. The relationship between the past and the present is a lot more complicated than drawing straight lines or noting that those lines can't be drawn. And we, in both classes, had a chance to talk about that kind of complexity in the relationship between something that happened long ago and something that we're experiencing today. We also had something else. my students and I felt like COVID-19 had kind of opened a portal to the past in a way that I had not experienced ever before when teaching about the plague. A portal that might help us not only understand their world, but also understand our own world because of those similarities. And so in both my courses, as we looked and thought about images like these, I posed a question. How might learning about the Black Death help us navigate our COVID-19 world? And I asked this question to students very specifically based on their own experience. How has it helped you to do so already? This is the question that frames the lecture today. And the reason why is because of the many fantastic answers that I got back in the course of live class discussions, in the course of written discussion boards when we moved to remote learning in March, and also in the final papers and presentations that students in my history seminar gave, where they had the opportunity to respond to this question in a written form. Some did PowerPoint presentations, they wrote editorials for newspapers, they had a variety of other creative ideas for engaging with this question and sharing it with what they imagined was a broader public. So today I wanted to talk to you about what they came up with, what we all came up with together, essentially how we succeeded in harnessing the past for the present, how we explored and discovered ways that studying the Black Death really can help us make sense of and navigate the world that we're living in today. So I'm going to start by giving you just a little bit of background on the Black Death to orient you, but keeping in mind I'm giving you only a very sketchy sketch. And then I'm going to talk to you specifically about a text that became the centerpiece of so many of our discussions and the source of so many of the lessons that we learned. A text called the Decameron by someone called Giovanni Boccaccio. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about him in a minute. And in the process of giving you this lecture, I want to give you a sense not just of what we did in our class, but also what you might be doing in other history or humanities courses, how you grapple with studying texts, how you develop answers to bigger questions, like why am I studying this anyway? What am I going to get out of reading works of literature and studying history at the university level? So, and we'll pull those things together as I move towards the end of today's lecture. First, I'm going to give a big thank you to the students in both these classes this spring, and I think there's some of them who enjoyed today's lecture, for all that they have done to help me put this lecture together. So those of you who haven't taken courses at SFU, you get a sense also of how much we teachers rely on you students for helping us to learn and helping to teach one another. So a bit of an introduction first about the Black Death. You probably have some basic understanding of what the Black Death is, the Great Death, the plague. The name Black Death comes from the fact that if you contracted this disease, it would often turn your limbs, your fingertips and other parts of your body a very disturbing black color. The image here, the much more pleasant pink color, is a microscopic view of the source of this disease and those symptoms, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. We've learned a great deal about the Black Death, the microbiology, pathology behind it that was unknown to the people of the 14th century, and yet we're still learning so much based on the inevitable fragmentary evidence that we have from this period in European history. The Black Death, a disease that, that emerged in Central Asia in the middle part of the 14th century, was the defining event, arguably, for the history of much of the world in the 14th century. As a Europeanist, I focus particularly on its effects on Europe, and that's what I'll give you as the very quick background today. You're looking at a map that shows you the very speedy spread of this disease through Europe. When it arrived first by sea routes, ports in places like Constantinople, southern Italy and Greece, and quickly spread through land routes and river routes as merchants went north and as the disease-bearing rats went with them. So the disease is carried in part by fleas on rats, and those traveled with merchants and the very globalizing world of the medieval Europe. As people became more interconnected, that meant that they spread disease as well as shared ideas and goods and products. We've learned that the disease spread in other ways too, in ways reminiscent of our COVID-19, through the air. And the various forms of the disease, and there were several kinds, were spread in these various routes. It was devastating. It was fatal on a level that left the population of Europe with staggering losses. We estimate anywhere between 1/3 and nearly 2/3 of the population of Europe was wiped out, parts more heavily than others. Some cities never fully recovered. And the demographic results, the demographic effects, meant that Europe did not catch up in terms of its population for centuries after that. And the many long-term effects of the Black Death could occupy me for the rest of this lecture. They were economic, they were social, they were religious and intellectual, they were political, and I could go on. But right now, I want you to have that general awareness of how this disease was an earthquake for Europe, how it transformed people at all levels of their lives. And I'd encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about this, this seismic disaster, to think about taking classes that explore it more fully with other documents and other ways of finding meaning in this, this important event. That includes, of course, I happen to be teaching in the fall, which is a survey course on medieval and Renaissance Europe. Here are some of the images that we have of the record devastation, an image created at the time of the so many bodies being buried, and then what we have as our remains as we've been able to dig up the burial sites of so many of these victims and the source of so much of our information. Our route in, and the route into the Black Death for many of my students this past semester, was through Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron. And Bettina, I'd like you to put up the first poll question if you could. Have you heard of Giovanni Boccaccio? Is this a name that you are familiar with?
Now, it's interesting. Miranda just said in the chat that she was just talking about Boccaccio to her family today and about the link to COVID-19. So we have some students clearly on the call who will respond a resounding yes to this question.
That's great. Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. The majority of you look like you haven't yet heard of him. So you're in for a treat. I am delighted to be the one to introduce you to this, this fascinating author, intellectual, and very important figure in general in the history of Renaissance literature, intellectual culture, and especially Italy. And then I have another question, perhaps for those of you who have heard of him but haven't done much with him. Have you read any of the Decameron? Okay. Wonderful. That helps me right away. Most of you, by far, it looks like about 80% of you have not. So you haven't read it, so it's my responsibility to introduce you a little bit to what this text is about. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron and Giovanni Boccaccio himself obviously belong to this moment in time I'm talking about. Boccaccio was an author, someone who was very well educated at his time in the classical education that was beginning to take off and become the foundation of the Renaissance. He was someone who had lived and was from Florence and other parts of Italy as well, who was very well connected with the merchant community and knew a lot about all sorts of different movements around the world, including those that brought the Black Death to the Italian shores. Boccaccio lived through the Decameron, lived through the plague, lived through the Black Death, and he was in Florence when it arrived, and it devastated the city of Florence around him. His Decameron, a collection of 100 stories, and I will show you just the thickness of this text to show you how big it is. This collection of 100 stories begins with an introduction that is his eyewitness account of what the plague did to Florence and how people responded. And it is an arresting story and one of the most important documents we have about how the plague affected people at that particular moment. So he wrote it in the wake of the Black Death, penning some of these stories, adding to ones he'd already come up with, and framing this collection of tales about which I will discuss a little bit more in a moment. He framed them in the context of Black Death that he was living in. This book, as daunting as it looks in its size, is considered by, I would say, the vast majority of my students to be one of the best texts they read at university. It is captivating, it is absorbing, it will make you howl with laughter, and it will probably also in places make you cry. And it's not me telling you this, I'm again sharing what my students have said. So interested are some of them from my last semester that we formed a reading group over the summer to continue looking at many of the stories that I didn't assign for those classes. And others have gone off and bought the book to do the same themselves. I'd like to talk to you now about what the students and I got out of the Decameron as we approached this question, the question of what it can tell us, how it can help us with our situation today as we face our COVID-19 world. And I'd like to do that by first talking about the introduction to the Decameron. I'm going to go back to that slide in a minute. The introduction to the Decameron is where Boccaccio talks about his experience looking out and watching the Black Death as it claims the lives of Florentines around him, including his father, his stepmother, and many of his closest friends. It is a section of the Decameron which is comparatively short, but it is one that is very, very rich. And many of the students in their response to this question referred specifically to how these pages of Boccaccio's work helped them navigate what they were going through right now in COVID-19. So how did it help them to do so? I've selected 3 different ways. Again, using the voices of my students. So listen to what they had to say. For several of them, reading Boccaccio's description, which was disturbing, which was tragic, and left them with vivid images in their minds of how the Black Death hurt and in many ways made the society of the time unravel. It gave students perspective and reassurance. As we talked about what happened in the age of the mid-14th century, we looked at our own fears, our own concerns, our own sense of the unknown, and felt like maybe we were going to be okay. Just looking at this image right here gives you a sense of where that reassurance came from. And in fact, I'm using images that one of my students used in a PowerPoint as she tried to explain why she felt more reassured and confident as she read the introduction. We have medical science at a level that they did not have. We have PPE that is maybe not perfect, but certainly will protect many of us more effectively. We have knowledge and tools and a means to spread information that, while certainly filled with challenges and flaws, puts us in a better position. We are better poised to face the damage that this virus may do to us. And so we have some sense of hope, some sense of reassurance in those moments of panic and unknown. Historians remind you, and they will remind you in your class, that studying about the past is often about climbing into somebody else's shoes to help cultivate a sense of empathy for other people and understanding for their times. In this case, my students found that that exercise can do something else, that climbing into somebody's shoes. It can help cultivate a sense of calm, a deeper understanding, a better perspective, a healthier perspective in some ways about the world and the situation that they themselves found themselves in. As I say, this was what one student emphasized as she presented her PowerPoint at the end of the term, and others joined in unison in sharing the same reaction. Other students came away from the introduction to Boccaccio's Decameron by having a better understanding of the behavior that we see around us during COVID-19. There are, in Boccaccio's introduction, 4 categories of people reacting to the plague. You have people who close themselves up into their houses and have no contact with the world around them. You have others that flee entirely from where the disease seems to be and escape in an even more dramatic way. He noted that there were others who went about cautiously their daily lives, taking precautions, but not changing things so radically as those other groups. And then there were those who seemed to be indifferent, or who cares was their attitude. The ones who went around partying as if there was no tomorrow, and those who seemed rather careless when they encountered people and didn't take any precautions at all. Now, I ask you this question, and I'll ask Bettina to put the question up on the screen. Have you encountered anybody, especially who falls into that last category of people? People who seem to not take COVID-19 very seriously, those who you might brush past in the grocery store and they cough. Those who want to go out and get back to the restaurants and the bars or get together in groups, are these things that you, 100%, okay. And I'm getting a sense that those encounters too, for many of you, have left you feeling frustrated or upset. That's the other question that I had. Well, I'm glad to hear you having these responses. I share them, my students share them. We talked about these in our classes. And one of my students had a really interesting response as he read through the categories that Boccaccio was talking about. How do Boccaccio's ways of understanding and grouping people help us to navigate folks we meet in the grocery store who might not have a mask and stand right next to us as we're searching the shelf? Well, he said, maybe it can change how we react to them. We might be inclined to get upset with them or to see them as idiots. We don't understand what they're doing, all of which is a very natural way to react. But another way to think about it is that they're just being human beings. This is human nature. This is something that we should expect, as aggravating as it is. And so this student reasons in the editorial he wrote for the end of the semester, this can help us to manage maybe not what they're doing, but our own reactions. He talked about how he would freak out in a grocery store because of the reactions that he felt, or the reactions that he saw from these other people. And as he thought about Boccaccio, he recognized that there was nothing that he could do. There was an inevitability about that behavior. And it helped him to stay calm, to put it in perspective, maybe not necessarily to be more forgiving, but it helped him to cope and to recognize that there are going to be people like this. They're not individuals who are misbehaving, but it is in many ways how human nature behaves. So here we have another sort of practical application of a text from the 14th century. Did you imagine that something written almost 7 centuries ago could help you grocery shop? I certainly didn't, and this student brought that into focus in a way that was really remarkable and really creative as well. And so you can think about that the next time you see scenes like this and you have some shared concerns. The last point I want to raise with you, the last lesson that came out of our discussions of this introduction, is the importance of kindness in the context of COVID-19. One of the things that Boccaccio is emphasizing in his introduction, that comes up again and again as the theme, is the lack of compassion that people showed to one another as they were dying, as they saw family members suffer and contract this devastating illness. They fled, they went away, they did not help. They were so terrified and afraid that they couldn't think of others, but only themselves. If only people had treated one another better, Boccaccio says, the tragedy would not have been as bad. So the plague, he says, infected a lot of people quite literally, but it also infected them with something besides the bacterium. It infected them with indifference and callousness and selfishness. Now, in and of itself, this is a very useful warning, right? But what made it more useful was the context in which we were hearing this in the middle of March, and how it helped us to put into perspective something that we have heard, and all of us have heard now very often, from Dr. Bonnie Henry, who is our public health officer here in BC. Be kind, be calm, be safe. And I want to emphasize those first 2 words there, which really struck me, and we talked about it in one of my classes. Boccaccio's words made me see Bonnie Henry's words in a different light, and especially those 2 first words. This "be kind" statement is much more than just a feel-good phrase. Practicing kindness is a crucial part of the province's public health initiative, just as important as hand washing. And there's a reason that she gives kindness a priority in this short and important message. It's wise, it's an urgent matter. And the absence of kindness, as Boccaccio tells us, was as much of a plague as the plague itself. So I guess you could say that reading Boccaccio's introduction helped me and others to really get Bonnie Henry on another level. And it left me and others with a sense of even greater trust and confidence in her recommendations. That there was a direct way that Boccaccio was helping me to take the next steps as I wandered through, as my students wandered through their new and unfamiliar COVID-19 world. So here are just some of the practical and surprising ways that a book that is 6 centuries old and then some became a kind of self-help for me and for my students. In the time I have remaining, I will share with you a few other lessons that we learned from the stories in Boccaccio's Decameron. And this is where the fun begins. There are 100 of them, as I say. This is a thick book. I do not assign all the stories in this text in any of my classes, but I have made a point to assign at least one in every single course that I teach, and it is well worthwhile. The stories Boccaccio tells cover the spectrum, from fairy tale romances to heart-wrenching tragedies, from stinging social satire to a raucous send-up of the Roman Catholic Church, from sex and violence to slapstick and witty repartee. Boccaccio's stories are shocking, they are engaging, and they are profoundly human. They're not about the plague directly. In fact, the plague itself is nowhere to be found in these stories. But there's something interesting that connects the kind of upheaval and change that you see in these tales and what the plague does in terms of transforming the society in which they take place. So the stories Boccaccio tells us are connected quite directly insofar as he sets the stories as told by a group of 7 women and 3 men who leave Florence in the context of the Black Death. They are some of the ones that say, we're getting out of here. And they go out into the countryside and they entertain and amuse themselves by telling 10 stories for 10 days. So that is the context, the framework for these stories, which themselves don't have a lot to do with the Black Death, but they do in other ways more indirectly. And they also, as my students tell us, have a lot to do with COVID-19. I'm going to show you a few pictures of a few stories and give you a snapshot of what each one is about to give you a sense of the variety that is in there. This is a series of images that comes from one of the earliest manuscripts we have of this text, which belongs to the Vatican Library and the first complete French translation. So I'm just going to give you a short synopsis, which Boccaccio gives of a few of these stories, and then show you an image. On the 3rd day, the 3rd story tells us that under the under the pretext of going to confession, and I cannot actually see my full slide there, a lady who is enamored of a young man induces a solemn friar to pave the way unwittingly for the total fulfillment of her desires. So clever woman, as is pictured here, she is talking to a friar or a priest about a man that she's in love with, and he, without realizing it, passes all that information along to her would-be lover, who then promptly finds a way to get together with her. Here he is climbing up the ladder. So very clever and a very funny story that is a send-up of members of the church. The 4th day, first story, is one of those Romeo and Juliet heart-wrenching tales. You have the description here that I will let you read. A sad story, a tragic story, which also carries with it a picture I will show you quickly right now. Here is the daughter of Tancredi, who has found her lover secretly, and her father up here somehow in the chimney has spied them both and takes his revenge on her by killing her lover, and she responds by taking her own life. So not all the stories are funny, but they all make you think and are very powerful. The 2nd day in the 4th story is a different one altogether. Landolfo Ruffolo, a merchant who is ruined, becomes a pirate, then becomes captured and is shipwrecked. His life looks like it's going nowhere, but he somehow survives and finds that what he clung to get out of the ocean is actually a chest full of jewels that he is able to live off of and prosper successfully for the rest of his life. So a wild and woolly tale that ends very happily. There is that chest with the jewels, and there he is loading them onto a ship after his shipwreck. So how do stories like this, and there are many others, help us navigate our COVID-19 worlds? My students responded with so many wonderful answers and very personal ones as well. For one student, it was all about optimism. When she read those happy endings, and there are many of them, the merchant rescued at sea and who has all of those jewels at the end, the woman who manages to unite with her lover after this very clever scheme, lots of happy endings. The student wrote that these endings, in the context of stories where that kind of happiness seemed completely unlikely, totally improbable, was precisely what she needed back in March and April. They gave her a real sense of hope and comfort at a time when her own future, when our own future was so dizzyingly unclear. And it wasn't just the endings themselves, it was knowing that Boccaccio wrote them in the middle of uncertainty, when to him and everyone around him, life was so uncertain. So it was that shared experience that she felt. It gave Boccaccio credibility to speak optimistically and for her to take a little bit of optimism from those stories for her. And that's what she talked about in her last assignment. Right here, a couple of the stories I've just told you about and the happy endings that come from them. For another student, many other students, in fact, it was all about escape. Escape, especially into laughter. So many of Boccaccio's stories are laugh out loud funny. Some compared them to Monty Python, or to cartoons, or to the favorite slapstick sitcoms that are on TV now. The humor is unexpected, it's shocking, it comes out in details and language, and it gave everyone an outlet. An outlet in a way that, again, was useful not only because they loved reading these stories and going somewhere with them, but also because it helped to sanction the other escape hatches that they felt themselves experiencing. Boccaccio wrote these stories in the middle of a plague. And he had people sitting around talking about the plague, or rather having gone through the plague, talking about these stories, entertaining themselves, 100 of them. This was okay, this is what you should do. And students talked about how they felt somewhat guilty if they, in the middle of knowing everything that was going on around them, were binging on their favorite Netflix show, were entertaining themselves with TikTok videos. Isn't that the wrong thing to do? Isn't that irresponsible? Aren't I being a bad person somehow? Boccaccio tells them no, resoundingly no, with 100 stories to take them away. And so do the storytellers, who remind them that they were there coping and needing those tales to get through those tough times. And that's what these students felt. Not only did the stories give them escape, but helped to justify that it was a kind of therapy that was necessary and perfectly acceptable. So really valuable. And think about that too, if you find that sort of conflict of emotions yourself as you are managing the COVID-19. I think I will save my last suggestion for how we could get things out of the Black Death. Or rather out of Boccaccio's Decameron, because I want to save some room for questions. But I'll just say to you right now that you may be wondering if my students and I are reading too much into this book. What are we getting out of it? Perhaps Boccaccio didn't mean for us to do all of these things, and you're quite right, he might not have. But we do know that Boccaccio was someone who was very socially conscious, that he was part of a group of thinkers, of writers who wrestled with the society around them in their writing. And in many ways, I think he thought of himself as a kind of first responder to the series of crises that compounded the one that we've been talking about, the Black Death. And that is something that we discussed in our classes as well. You don't usually think of a work of literature as being a kind of first responder, but I think Boccaccio clearly has revealed this to so many of my students, and I hope I've captured some of that for you today as well. And in the process, I hope that you have some sense more generally about how we can approach the past with answers that you might not expect, with questions that are big and important. What's the point of studying the past or the humanities? What are you going to get out of it? Why take things at university about literature, about worlds that were so long ago? There's so many ways to answer this question. You may love it. You may want to read more of a certain author. You may want to go and visit a place through history that you can't do right now live. But I want you to realize and to keep your mind open that there are all sorts of possible ways to answer this question. Don't discount the value of studying these things. I don't think I could have predicted the many practical, powerful ways the students and I engaged with the past because of the portal that was opened through this pandemic. So be open-minded to it. See what you might find in a work of literature, in a course on history, as you go on at SFU or in high school or wherever you are right now. And as you do, go off and pick up a copy of Boccaccio. You won't be disappointed. Thank you all.